Hi, folks. In this video, I talk more about Dostoevsky's view of the human condition and the various types of despair that we engage in when we fail to live authentically or fail to mediate between these two different parts of ourselves. Because Dostoevsky shares this idea with Kierkegaard that we're fundamentally of a conflicted nature. We have both a body and a soul, or we have carnal passions and we have a spiritual side, spiritual passions, and trying to come to grips with that tension and mediate between them or come to some sort of synthesis between these conflicting urges is what we have to do as humans. Dostoevsky describes this in many ways, and it comes up all over the novel. So we see it as a contrast between characters who act with their head and logic, or characters who act with their heart. Or we see characters talk about the earthly side of themselves, being an insect, contrasted with the angelic or heavenly side of themselves. You really see this in the different ways in which characters can engage in love, because the concept of love is the fundamental one of the entire novel. But that can have sort of a base, sort of bad side when it's in just pure carnal lust and bodily love. But it also has this spiritual side, a kind of Christian love of one's neighbor, love of all of humanity, love of the earth. In a non-erotic sense, this kind of spiritual passion can be expressed in love as well, but it's fundamentally different than the expression that we see if it's just on the bodily side. Or finally, we also see characters who are engaged in moral acts and are pulled by morality versus other fundamental forces in their lives. Now, the question is, how do we make sense of this? How do we deal with these conflicting urges for ourselves? And Dostoevsky has this very complicated scenario where all of the different characters give us failed ways of trying to mediate this condition, failed ways of grappling with human existence. And we can actually see all the different types of despair illustrated by the different sorts of characters. Now, there are going to be some heroes by the end of the novel. So by the end of the novel, some people will get saved. But in my opinion, none of them is actually a kind of angelic character who doesn't need any transformation in order to be saved. So I'm going to argue one of the things I'll try to convince you of in this video is that none of the characters, even Alyosha or Alexei, the most saintly, godly-like character in the story, actually isn't already mediating the human condition, but he needs to grow in order to live authentically too. So let me say something. These are the forms of despair from Kierkegaard: not having a self, not having awareness of oneself, not having any sort of reconciliation, or an unsuccessful reconciliation. I think the Karamazov family illustrates all four of those things. And it's only by the end of the novel that some of the characters actually get successful reconciliations. They get out of despair, and we're going to see how they do so. What is actually the conditions of success for these characters, and thereby Dostoevsky's vision of living authentically. Now, let me start with Smerdyakov, but because I know his character is quite controversial. There's ways in which Smerdyakov, yes, I do know he is human, but he is represented animalistically as almost subhuman, as sociopathic in the novel. He is the character who is completely devoid of love. He has not been nurtured. He has not received love. Even Grigory and Marfa, his adopted parents, didn't even treat him with love and treated him as an amoral monster. And so that's why he is just given the job. He's not acknowledged by Fyodor as one of his true sons. And so there's ways in which I think by portraying this aspect of him as an animal, as akin to the devil in his complete lack of morality, he is treated as if he doesn't have the soul part. He doesn't have this condition of soul or spirituality. And that means, in my opinion, he's the lowest form of despair on Kierkegaard's reckoning. He's one who doesn't even have a self. Because what it is to be human is to have these two aspects of our condition. And if Smerdyakov doesn't even have a soul over here, or he's at least, he's the character who gives us an example of such a condition, then he would actually be the form of despair of lacking a self entirely. I think things are quite different from Fyodor. I think there's several passages in the text where we do get this inkling that Fyodor has some conception of morality. He just completely suppresses it or represses it. He denies its existence. He's got a soul, and every once in a while, through his drunken moments, he has a kind of spiritual awakening, but then he completely recoils from it and runs away. So he's a kind of despair where he has a self. He actually has both sides of this human self, but he completely represses one side of it, and so he lives just purely as on the bodily side. And this is well represented by his character as being one of total passion and carnal lust, and sort of loving life and food and drink, and just living a debaucherous lifestyle. Now, so that's state number 2, no awareness of self. And I also think Dmitri represents yet another kind of despair. So this is the way in which the Karamazov crew give us all the different ways in which we can fail as human beings. And what we have to figure out is which one of them are actually going to get some salvation by the end. Dmitri is unlike his father. Dmitri has total awareness of morality and his noble side and the fact that he has a soul. He just sees also quite clear-headedly that he has the same carnal lusts as his father and is just as base and just as much a rogue as his father is. And yet he doesn't repress either one of these sides. He is living the human condition most acutely by almost from moment to moment in this anxious state of being in total conflict. He feels the lack of reconciliation, the fact that he is at war with himself. He is in this deep state of tension. He has no mediation. Nothing is reconciling these competing forces between him. So that is his form of despair. Now, what that leaves is Ivan and Alexei as the last 2 characters. I think they are really complicated because in some ways they're the most diametrically opposed characters. Alexei is the arch-theist, the one who blindly follows God, and Ivan is the one who blindly follows atheism. He is the arch-atheist who blindly follows logic and philosophy and science. So in some ways they're diametrically opposed, but I actually think they are both representing the 4th form of despair, according to on this sort of Kierkegaardian, Dostoevskian conception of the human self. You see, we can only get a sense of this, I think, by dividing this spiritual side and seeing that there's actually sort of a theist and an atheistic reading of this. Because you can talk about your soul, or you could just talk about your mind, where there's no pretense that your mind necessarily lives beyond your body or is destined for a supernatural heavenly afterlife. So your mind might just be something like your brain. And talk about sort of your brain processes is quite different than what it means to talk about your heart and metaphorically how your heart functions in a spiritual sense. Or instead of just thinking about sort of our angelic side, you can think and spiritual passion, you can think of a kind of passion of the scientist, like this pure objective logic and rationality as an objective force. Remember the previous discussions about these twin forces of Greek philosophy and Christianity? Well, I think here we see 2 different versions of this aspect of what makes us different than mere animals who just maybe have a body. But we have this inner dimension, but you can think of it in theistic terms or in sort of universal, objective, atheistic terms as well. And I think this helps us understand what's going on with both Ivan and Alexei. Just to give you a sense of the way in which love can be so different. Here's an interesting line that Ivan says it's from the section on rebellion in that reading. He says, "Sticky spring leaves, blue sky, I do love them. Such things you cannot love with your mind, not with logic, but with your insides, your guts. This loving with your guts, that's this heart. This is the kind of spiritual love." And this passage is ironic because Ivan is telling the readers something quite significant, that in Dostoevsky's worldview, there is very different types of love. Loving with your mind and with logic is not the same thing as loving with your heart or your guts. But ironically, and Dostoevsky does this all the time, he has a character say and speak an insight, but the character fundamentally actually lacks the bit of insight that they're giving voice to. See, Ivan is onto this. He understands this distinction, and he's claiming to actually be on the side right now where he actually feels this kind of spiritual love with his guts. But ironically, we see through the speech of rebellion and the Grand Inquisitor, Ivan doesn't actually live up to this whatsoever. In this passage, read the pages right before 230 and after 230 very carefully. Ivan actually doesn't live up to this. He's aware of it, but he's in many ways denying this. And that gives us a sense of the kind of despair Ivan has. Ivan has this purely philosophical conception of himself. He doesn't really fully acknowledge his spiritual side. He says it's his youth that is propelling him to this kind of love, but soon it's going to extirpate, and so he's probably not going to live past 30. He's going to make sure of that because by then his youthful connection to life is going to be gone, and he's just going to be left with his objective, logical mind, who's going to just be in despair. I think Ivan even uses the word despair to describe that state. Ivan also, in many ways, struggles with his bodily side. So in this way, his friendship with Alyosha, Alexei, represents a ability to get in touch with his soul. I think he does have this. And his romantic or possible romantic relationship with Katya shows that he has a bodily side and he's almost going to get in touch with it. But the difficulties of that relationship and the failure of that relationship really connect with his suppression or his repression of his bodily nature. He's the kind of person who always wants to be self-sufficient. He detests both his father and his brother, Dmitri, because of their base carnal passions. They both discuss him. There's many places where he looks down on Dmitri for his insect self and his father for his wildly passions. Ivan really is somebody who always wants to be in control of his life, and both his body or his religious love, spiritual passion, are ways in which life threatens to lose his grip on control, and those are things that he's constantly fighting against. So Ivan thinks he has everything, the world figured out, but it's really because he has put into suppression these aspects of himself. And this is why Dostoevsky really thinks he's in despair. You can't repress any of yourself. You have to find a way to mediate and reconcile the human condition. You can't get along by getting rid of part of it. Now, the most difficult character to understand, in my view, is Alexei, because there's a way in which he's quite like Ivan. Alexei does not know bodily passion. So he is the kid who ran off to the monastery at a young age and really is living the monastic life, the celibate life. He is denying his bodily drives. He is living frugally. So he has no love for like life and money, rich food and drink. Those things are all pushed apart from him. And we also see he is not in touch with his insect self. Interestingly, he understands these things. And there's several passages in the novel where he admits he's a Karamazov too, and sort of being this base carnal person is partly what it is to be a Karamazov. And he even admits knowing he has an insect nature, but he's the one who does the best at keeping it at bay or repressing it. Whether he can come in touch with this is really the question of whether he's going to succeed in the novel or not. And also, in many ways, he is the opposite of Ivan, because his whole mental life is over here in the soul, the theistic version, and he is not in touch with the atheistic version. For Dostoevsky, Alexei has to learn. He has to understand that there's more to life than just his spiritual passion. And that's why Zosima, his elder in the monastery, tells him he must go into the world. The way I read that is he has to admit that he is a human with both body and soul, and he has to somehow come to a reconciliation. He is so far just repressing the rest of himself, and that's actually not going to be a successful way of living for him. That's not actually what Dostoevsky thinks is the authentic human condition. So really, Alexei is no angel. This is something that's different between the novel and the movie, in my opinion. The movie really misses the passages, and it doesn't include his big crisis of faith. So there's many ways in which in the novel we see him as a multidimensional character that does not come across really clearly in the movie. But this is actually critical to understanding Dostoevsky's whole vision. Alexei is also not one of the people who is an authentic individual. He has to go through a process of learning and reconciliation through the novel if he's going to have success by the end of it. So what we need to see is, of all these Karamazovs and all of their forms of despairs, how are they going to, which are the ones that are going to end up succeeding? Another way to see this connection between Ivan and Alexei is to think about this dimension. I think is really insightful, because you can have engagement with the world in just with the bodily side, in pure sensuality. And this is Fyodor most acutely. This is Dmitri in some ways too, because he feels the pull of this. And characters who sort of are denying this half of themselves are way over here in pure sensuality. And Dostoevsky condemns that. Dostoevsky does not want you to see Fyodor and decide to live your life like him at the end of the novel. But at the same time, this is Dostoevsky's complicated vision. And this is, I think, what many people miss on the reading of the film. This is what's completely ruined by the movie version of it, is Dostoevsky is not also telling you to deny your body, and instead all the truth resides in the afterlife and in heaven and being purely theistic. Because the asceticism, this is what Ivan and Alexei both share. They've denied the bodily sides. They're detached from the world in certain ways. Neither one of them experiences the kind of sensual lusts that Dmitri and Fyodor experience. But at the same time, they do it in very different ways. But you can be a scientist and be an ascetic, and you can be a monk and be an ascetic. So asceticism, if you're not familiar with the term, asceticism just refers to denial of worldly pleasures. So that's often associated with religious asceticism, where people classic monks in the Christian tradition or monks in the Buddhist tradition. This goes far beyond just Christianity. You see it in Islam as well, and in Judaism. You cannot, if you do not allow yourself to engage in worldly pleasures, whether it be food or drink or sexual relations, any of those things, if those are looked down upon by your religion in general or your religious order, the particular group you're involved with, then that is an ascetic religion. And Ivan, in many ways, experiences a similar sort of asceticism. He's austere with his life, not on religious grounds, but just in an atheistic way. Dostoevsky does not think this is the answer whatsoever, nor is pure sensuality the answer. In some bizarre way, we have to find a reconciliation of our human condition. And how do we do that? That is Dostoevsky's. That is what he is going to give us, a new vision, different than Kierkegaard's, of human authentic living. If you can get a reconciliation between these without denying or repressing either side, then you're going to be living the right way for Dostoevsky. Okay, thanks.